The alkali wind carved through Bear Creek's main street like a blade, turning the summer air thick enough to choke on. Every storefront shimmered in the heat, and the constant hammering from Pike's silver mine echoed off the canyon walls like distant gunfire. In the center of the dusty thoroughfare, a young Lakota warrior knelt beside a white woman, whose desperation hung around her like smoke from a dying fire. Toddy, 26 summers old and lean as a hunting knife, wore the eagle feather bonnet of council business, not war paint. His dark eyes studied the bundle in the woman's arms, a newborn whose labored breathing whispered of fever and failing strength. Around them, townsfolk formed a wary circle, hands drifting toward weapons, with the casual menace of people who'd learned to shoot first and ask questions of the corpses. "Please." Caroline rasped, her voice cracked from thirst and grief. She couldn't have been more than 23, but desperation had carved lines around her green eyes that belonged on someone twice her age. The torn muslin swaddling in her arms barely contained a child whose skin burned with fever. "Take me instead. Save him." Deputy Barnes thumbed back his pistol's hammer with a metallic click that sliced through the desert silence. A wagon wheel groaned under its load. Overhead buzzards traced patient circles against the brass sky, waiting for someone to make the wrong move. Toddy ignored the crowd's hostility, his attention fixed on the infant's fever-flushed skin, showing through gaps in the makeshift swaddling. Without looking up, he pushed his waterskin into Caroline's trembling hands, the leather warm from the sun, but the water still cool. "No one buys a life today," he said quietly, his calloused palm moving to shield the baby's face from the grit that swirled around them like tiny daggers. Their eyes met over the child's head, her raw desperation crashing against his steady resolve like waves against stone. The moment stretched between them, heavy with recognition that this wasn't about commerce or the usual frontier bargains. This was about something that couldn't be purchased, traded, or sold. A spooked horse suddenly reared at the hitching post, iron shoes flashing silver in the brutal sunlight. The animal's eyes rolled white with panic as it fought against the leather that held it. Toddy moved faster than thought, lunging forward to yank Caroline clear of the thrashing hooves. The baby pressed against his chest for one heartbeat, fragile as a sparrow's egg, before he passed the child back to safety, his movements gentle despite the urgency. Before anyone could settle back into the strange tableau, whiskey, Tom stumbled from the saloon, swinging a half-empty bottle like a club. The drunk miner's bloodshot eyes fixed on Toddy, with the particular hatred that came from a bottle's bottom and years of nursing grievances against anyone different from himself. "Get your filthy hands off the white woman, you—" The bottle arced toward Caroline's head in a vicious swing. Toddy blocked with his forearm, feeling glass bite deep and warm blood start to flow down his wrist. Caroline tore a strip from her already ragged hem. Without hesitation, her fingers steady despite everything as she wound the makeshift bandage around his cut. Their hands brushed in the process, her skin soft against his calluses. And something passed between them that went beyond gratitude, beyond the simple human contact of strangers helping each other. It was recognition of a deeper kind, the understanding that passed between survivors. That was foolish. Toddy said, though, whether to the drunk or to himself, he couldn't say. Foxy Kate emerged from her establishment, all business in her practical dress and no-nonsense manner. The saloon keeper had seen enough trouble in Bear Creek to remain unimpressed by more of it. "He's on council business," she announced to the crowd, her voice carrying the authority earned through years of keeping peace in a lawless town. "Stand down, all of you." The circle began to disperse like smoke in the wind, but the tension didn't leave entirely. It settled into the spaces between buildings, lurked in the shadows of doorways, waited for the next spark to set it blazing. This wasn't over. It was barely begun. Bear Creek squatted between the Bluebird Crossing Stage Road and Montgomery Pike's silver mine like a parasite feeding on the traffic between civilization and the hole carved from the mountainside. The town's single street ran straight as a rifle shot, lined with false front buildings that promised more than they delivered. Behind them, the prairie folded away in waves of baked gold grass, broken only by the dark scar of mining tailings and the brown ribbon of Coal Creek that gave the place its name. The railroad spur clacked day and night with ore cars full of silver-bearing rock, their iron wheels grinding out a rhythm that had become the town's heartbeat. Pike owned the mine, the spur, most of the buildings, and a good portion of the souls who worked them. They called him Stoneheart, though, never where he could hear it. The man had built his empire on the simple principle that everything had a price, and he had more money than most people had principles. Toddy had ridden into this nest of avarice and ambition, with a small delegation of Lakota, or their horses raising dust clouds that announced their arrival long before they reached the town proper. They carried official papers, a treaty copy, and a letter from Agent Morrison at the agency that gave them the legal right to be here, though legal and safe were two different animals entirely in Bear Creek. The delegation's mission was simple enough on paper demand that Pike stop his illegal damming of Coal Creek that fed the reservation gardens downstream. The reality, as Toddy had learned in his 26 years of life, was always more complicated than the paper it was written on. Pike's dam had turned the creek into a trickle during the dry months, leaving the reservation's corn withered and their children hungry. But Pike had money influence and the kind of legal help that could make a treaty look like toilet paper if it served his purposes. The old bullet furrow across Toddy's back, a souvenir from a skirmish near Gunpowder Gulch 3 years past, pulled tight when he lifted heavy objects, a constant reminder that negotiating peace with armed men required a particular kind of courage that not everyone possessed. He moved carefully when shouldering his pack or mounting his horse, the old wound making itself known with each twist of his torso. Caroline had arrived in Bear Creek through tragedy rather than choice. The wagon train accident that had killed her husband months earlier had left her stranded with nothing but the clothes on her back and a pregnancy she'd barely begun to show. She'd found work scrubbing laundry behind Liesel's schoolhouse for pennies a day, keeping herself and her unborn child alive on watered broth and stubborn determination. Now, with baby Quentin barely 2 months old and burning with fever, those pennies might as well have been fool's gold. The child had sickened after the last dust storm, when desperation had driven her to give him water scooped from the muddy creek. She'd known it was risky, but the alternative had been watching him dehydrate in her arms while she had the means to help. The town's few decent souls could be counted on one hand, with fingers left over. Dr. Elijah Monroe stood horse-lean and sharp-eyed in his 40s, his hands bearing the calluses of a man who delivered more babies and set more bones than any frontier doctor had a right to survive. He'd come west after losing his practice in Chicago to drink and had stayed sober by staying busy with the endless stream of mining accidents and barroom casualties that Bear Creek provided. Liesel taught school in a building that doubled as the town's meeting hall, her 30-something years carrying the weight of education in a place where most folks considered book learning a luxury they couldn't afford. She'd been a teacher back in Pennsylvania before a scandal involving a married school board member had driven her west in search of a fresh start and a shorter memory. Quincy Hargrove farmed a hardscrabble plot east of town, his 50-odd years bent under the weight of trying to coax crops from soil that seemed actively hostile to growing anything useful. His well had started running muddy after Pike's latest expansion, adding one more worry to his already considerable collection. The law in Bear Creek came in the form of Sheriff Dusty Bill Hawkins, a man more tired than cruel, who discovered that keeping the peace was easier when you didn't look too hard at who was breaking it. He owed tabs at Pike's saloon and did Pike's bidding often enough to keep his badge, though it sat heavier on his chest with each passing year. Sometimes late at night, when the whiskey wore thin and his conscience grew loud, Hawkins would stare at himself in his shaving mirror and wonder when he'd stopped being a lawman and started being just another one of Pike's employees. Pike's influence extended through the town like roots from a poisonous tree. His foreman, Hatchet Harry, carried out orders with the enthusiasm of a man who enjoyed his work too much, while Quick Hand Pike's other enforcer had earned his nickname by being fast with a gun and slow with conversation. Together, they kept the peace Pike's way, which was to say they kept everyone too frightened to cause trouble. Montgomery Pike himself was a man in his 50s who wore expensive suits and carried himself with the bearing of someone who'd never been told no and meant to keep it that way. He'd built his fortune on silver and expanded it through shrewd investments and strategic bribes, but what drove him more than money was the obsession with legacy, ensuring that the Pike name would be remembered long after the silver played out and the mines were nothing but holes in the ground. That evening in the clinic behind Greenway's Mercantile, Caroline learned the true nature of her son's condition. The room smelled of carbolic acid and desperation, its cramped space filled with medical supplies that never seemed adequate to the demands placed upon them. Dr. Monroe bent over baby Quentin on his examination table, long fingers gentle as he checked temperature pulse and the telltale signs that separated ordinary sickness from something far more dangerous. Caroline pressed against the wall knuckles white, where she gripped the edge of a medicine cabinet. Toddy waited by the door, his presence solid and reassuring in the flickering lamplight. "It's not the usual flux," Monroe muttered, lifting Quentin to check the infant's responses. The baby's eyes were glassy with fever, his breathing rapid and shallow. "Looks like typhoid, and it's moving fast through his system." Caroline's sharp intake of breath cut through the room like a blade. Typhoid was a killer, especially for children Quentin's age. She'd seen it take whole families back in Missouri, burning through them like wildfire through dry grass. "What does he need?" Toddy asked, his voice steady despite the gravity of the diagnosis. Monroe set the baby down carefully, his expression grim. "Clean water-boiled broths, laudanum measured careful for the pain, and a specific tonic I'm short on. I posted for supplies 3 days ago, but the stage is stuck at Arrowhead Pass with the wheel trouble. Could be another week before it gets through." "A week." Caroline's voice broke on the words. "He doesn't have a week." The doctor's silence was answer enough. In the lamplight, Quentin looked impossibly small and fragile, his tiny chest rising and falling with each labored breath. The fever that racked his body would either break soon or break him. There was no middle ground with typhoid, no partial victories or moral compromises. That night, Caroline returned to her boarding shed behind Mrs. Patterson's rooming house to find a company script notice nailed to her door like a death warrant. The paper bore Pike's Mining Company seal and Sheriff Hawkins's official stamp, making it as legally binding as gravity. The debt it outlined Waterbarrel's rent and various fees she'd never agreed to amounted to more money than she could earn in 6 months of backbreaking labor. As she stared at the notice by lamplight, footsteps crunched on the gravel behind her. She turned to find Hatchet Harry and another of Pike's men approaching through the darkness, their intentions written in the way they moved, slow and confident, like predators who'd cornered their prey and were in no hurry to finish the kill. "Mrs. Webb," Harry said, touching his hat brim in a mockery of politeness. "Hope you got time to discuss your financial situation." "I'm reading it now," Caroline replied, keeping her voice level despite the fear that crawled up her spine like ice water. "See, that's the problem. Reading don't pay debts." Harry stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath and see the cruel amusement in his eyes. "But Mr. Pike, he's a reasonable man. He's got a proposition for you." The proposition, when it came, was delivered with the casual brutality of men who'd made such offers before. Work off the debt in Pike's upper rooms, above the saloon, servicing the miners who had money to spend, and needs that couldn't be met in polite company. It was prostitution dressed up in legal language, the kind of grim option that frontier life offered to desperate widows with mouths to feed and no other resources to sell. Caroline's response was immediate and instinctive. She spat in Harry's face. The slap that followed snapped her head sideways and brought tears to her eyes, but it also brought clarity. Pike wasn't just collecting a debt, he was claiming ownership. In his mind, she'd already been reduced to property, something to be used until it wore out and then discarded. That was foolish, Harry said, wiping her spit from his cheek with the back of his hand. Real foolish. You got until tomorrow night to come to terms with reality. After that, the sheriff gets involved and things get complicated for everyone. They left her standing in the darkness, the notice crumpled in her shaking hands. The shed that had been her only shelter suddenly felt like a trap, its thin walls no barrier against the kind of power Pike wielded in Bear Creek. She looked through the single dirty window at the lights of the town, each one representing someone who might help if they dared, but who would more likely turn away rather than risk Pike's displeasure. That's when she thought of the Lakota Warrior who'd knelt in the street to help a stranger's child. She found Toddy behind Kate's saloon, sitting on the back steps and cleaning his cut forearm with whiskey from a small bottle. The wound had stopped bleeding, but it would leave a scar to match the others that marked his hands and arms, the accumulated evidence of a life lived on the sharp edge of survival. I need to ask you something. Caroline said, her voice hoarse from crying and rage and the endless grit that never seemed to settle in Bear Creek. Toddy looked up, taking in her tear-stained face and the crumpled notice she still clutched in her fist. Ask. The words came out in a rush, desperate and shameful and necessary all at once. She told him about the debt, about Pike's offer, about the choice between her body and her son's life. She offered herself not to Pike, but to him, to the delegation, to anyone who might pay for the medicine Quentin needed to survive. I know what I'm asking. She finished, her voice steady now that the worst had been said. I know what it makes me. But he's my son, and I won't let him die because I was too proud to do what needed doing. Toddy was quiet for a long moment, the whiskey bottle forgotten in his hands. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of a promise that went deeper than money or medicine or the simple transaction she'd proposed. We will get what the child needs, he said, but not that way, never that way. Something shifted in Caroline's chest, a loosening of the tight knot of desperation that had been choking her since she'd read Pike's notice. For the first time since Quentin had fallen sick, she felt like she might not be facing the darkness alone. "Oh, why?" she asked. "Why would you help us?" Taddy corked the whiskey bottle and stood his movements careful around the old bullet wound that pulled at his back. Council duty is to protect the water. Clean water. The child needs clean water to live, and Pike's poison has taken that away. But... He paused, studying her face in the lamplight that spilled from Kate's back window. Sometimes duty and heart walk the same path. Caroline could see something else in his eyes, something that went beyond duty or council missions or the political complications of white Indian relations. She could see the same recognition that had passed between them in the street, the understanding that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the odds. "What do we do?" she asked. "First we get clean water for the medicine, then we deal with Pike." Toddy's voice carried the certainty of a man who'd made his decision and would see it through to whatever end awaited. "Are you willing to trust me?" Caroline looked at the crumpled notice in her hand, then at the man who just promised to help her fight the most powerful person in Bear Creek. The choice, when it came down to it, wasn't really a choice at all. "Yes," she said, "I trust you." The midnight ride to Quincy Hargrove's farm cut through prairie darkness thick as black wool, with only starlight to guide them through terrain that could hide bandits, wolves, or worse. Caroline rode behind Toddy on his sturdy paint horse, Quentin bundled against her chest in a sling fashioned from her shawl. The baby's fever radiated through the fabric, like heat from a forge, a constant reminder of how little time they had to work with. Quincy's farm lay 3 miles east of Bear Creek, far enough from Pike's influence to maintain some independence, but close enough to feel the mining operations' effects creeping across the land like a slow poison. His well dug deep into bedrock decades earlier by his father still ran cleaner than anything closer to town, though even it had started showing signs of contamination in recent months. "Riders coming up behind us," Toddy said quietly, his body tensing against Caroline's back. She could feel the change in his posture, the way his hand moved instinctively toward the rifle slung across his shoulder. Caroline turned to look over her shoulder and saw the distant bobbing of lanterns, 3 of them moving fast through the darkness, like fallen stars with malicious intent. Pike's men most likely, though, whether they were tracking the delegation or just happened to be riding the same direction, remained to be seen. "Can we outrun them?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not carrying double, and not with the baby." Toddy guided the horse off the main track and into a shallow wash that cut through the prairie like a wound in the earth. "We go quiet and hope they pass us by." They dismounted in the cover of sagebrush and stunted cottonwoods, Toddy holding the horse's muzzle to keep it from whinnying, while Caroline crouched with Quentin pressed against her shoulder. The baby stirred restlessly, his tiny fists clenching and unclenching with each wave of fever, and she found herself breathing in rhythm with Toddy's steady inhalations, trying to calm her racing heart before its pounding gave them away to anyone listening in the darkness. The riders passed within 50 yards of their hiding spot, close enough that Caroline could hear their voices carried on the night wind. She recognized Hatchet Harry's gravelly laugh and Quick Hand's higher-pitched cursing as they complained about being sent out to handle the Indian problem. In the middle of the night, the lanterns bobbed away toward town, leaving them alone with the whisper of wind through dry grass and the distant howl of coyotes claiming their territory. "They'll be back," Toddy said, helping Caroline to her feet, with a hand that lingered longer than necessary on her elbow. Pike doesn't give up easy once he's set his mind to something. They reached Quincy's place as the first hint of dawn touched the eastern horizon, like a promise of better things to come. The farmhouse sat small and weathered in the middle of 40 acres that had been fought over, fenced, and farmed by 3 generations of Hargroves. The land bore the scars of that struggle, irrigation ditches that had been dug and abandoned fence lines that had been moved and moved again, and the stubborn green of crops that refused to surrender to the harsh prairie climate. Quincy himself emerged from the barn as they approached, a shotgun in his hands and suspicion written across his weathered features until recognition dawned. He was a man in his 50s who'd learned that visitors after midnight rarely brought good news, but his expression softened when he saw Caroline's haggard appearance and the bundle she carried so protectively. "Toddy." The farmer lowered his weapon as understanding replaced wariness. "What brings you out here in the dark, and who's the lady?" "Sick child. Need clean water." Toddy dismounted and helped Caroline down, his hands steady and sure as he supported her weight. "Your deep well still running clear, Quincy?" The farmer's expression grew troubled as he took in the full implications of the request. "Clearer than anything in town, that's for certain. Come on, let's get you inside where Mary can have a look at the little one." The farmhouse kitchen was warm and welcoming after the cold ride, its walls lined with preserves and dried goods that spoke of careful preparation and hard-won prosperity. Quincy's wife, Mary, emerged from the bedroom, pulling a robe around her shoulders and immediately taking charge of the situation with the efficiency of a woman who'd raised 6 children on the frontier and buried 2 of them before their first birthdays. "Set him on the table," She instructed Caroline, spreading a clean blanket across the scarred wood surface that had served as everything from dining table to surgery table over the years. Let's have a look at what we're dealing with. While Mary examined Quentin with the practiced eye of someone who'd nursed her share of sick babies, Quincy and Toddy worked to draw water from the deep well behind the house. The pump handle squeaked with each stroke, but the water that flowed from it ran clear and cold, untainted by the chemicals and runoff that had poisoned Bear Creek's supply. "This is good water," Toddy said, filling his water skin in the containers Caroline had brought. "Clean as mountain snow and twice as precious." They boiled it on Mary's cast-iron stove, while coyotes yipped and howled in the darkness beyond the windows, their calls growing closer as the scent of human activity drew their curiosity. Caroline found herself watching Toddy's face in the lamplight as he tended the fire, noting the careful way he adjusted the flames and the gentle precision with which he measured Dr. Monroe's makeshift fever remedy into the steaming water. "You've done this before." She observed, her voice soft, with something that wasn't quite admiration, but wasn't far from it either. "My sister Atira had 3 children, lost one to fever when the agency medicine didn't come on time." His voice carried old grief, carefully controlled, but never entirely forgotten. Sometimes the old ways work better than the new ones, especially when the new ones are controlled by men like Pike. The medicine preparation took over an hour, during which Quentin's fever climbed higher, and his breathing grew more labored. Caroline held him against her chest, feeling the rapid flutter of his heartbeat, and the heat that seemed to pour off his tiny body like radiation from a forge. When she looked up, she found Toddy watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something that went beyond concern for a sick child, and entered territory she wasn't ready to name. "He's strong," Toddy said quietly. "Strong like his mother." "I don't feel strong," Caroline admitted, her voice barely audible above the wind rattling the windows. "I feel like I'm drowning in water so deep I can't see the bottom." Strong people drown too if they try to swim alone. But when they swim together. He let the thought hang unfinished, but Caroline understood his meaning. The medicine finished brewing just as the eastern sky began to lighten with the promise of dawn. Mary helped Caroline feed tiny spoonfuls to Quentin, while Toddy and Quincy kept watch at the windows for signs of Pike's riders returning with reinforcements and less charitable intentions. The baby took the medicine reluctantly, his face screwing up at the bitter taste. But he kept it down, which Mary pronounced a good sign. "The fever should break by evening if it's going to break at all," she said, wrapping Quentin in clean blankets that smelled of sunshine and honest work. "Keep him warm but not hot, and give him small sips of the boiled water every few minutes. And pray, child. Pray hard." As they prepared to leave, Quincy pressed additional supplies into their hands, jerked beef hardtack and a small bottle of whiskey for sterilizing wounds or fortifying courage, whichever proved more necessary. "You're going up against Pike," he said, and it wasn't a question. The farmer had lived in Bear Creek's shadow long enough to recognize the signs of an approaching storm. "He started this fight when he poisoned the water," Toddy replied, securing the supplies in his saddlebags. "We're just going to finish it." The ride back to Bear Creek took them through the growing dawn light, past fields where corn should have been growing tall and green, but instead stood stunted and brown from lack of clean irrigation. The mine's stamp mill hammered its relentless rhythm in the distance, and smoke from the processing furnaces painted dark smudges across the brightening sky like bruises on the face of morning. Halfway back to town, they encountered the aftermath of Harry's midnight ride. Tire tracks and hoof prints in the soft earth told the story of a confrontation, and a burned-out campsite beside the road showed where someone had made a stand against whatever forces Pike had sent into the darkness. Whether the unknown travelers had escaped or been captured remained unclear, but the message was unmistakable. Pike's reach extended far beyond Bear Creek's limits, and his patience was wearing thin. He's getting desperate. Caroline observed, studying the scene from horseback, while Quentin slept fitfully in her arms. Desperate men make mistakes. Toddy agreed, his eyes scanning the horizon for signs of movement. We'll be ready when he makes his. As they crested the final hill before town, Bear Creek spread out below them like a festering wound in the pristine prairie. The sun's first rays painted the false front buildings in deceptively warm colors, but Caroline could see the truth beneath the veneer. This was a place where power corrupted everything it touched, where decent people struggled to maintain their humanity against forces that sought to strip it away, piece by piece. But she was no longer facing that darkness alone. The man riding beside her had made a choice that went beyond duty or politics or the careful calculations of survival. He'd chosen to stand with her, and that choice would change everything that followed. Toddy's decision to stay past dawn transformed him from diplomatic visitor to wanted man in the space between one sunrise and the next. The delegation's safe passage expired with the morning light, and Sheriff Hawkins made it clear, apologetic but firm, that he couldn't guarantee protection beyond the town limits. The other members of the delegation, older men with families and responsibilities back on the reservation, made the practical choice to leave while they still could. But Toddy remained, forfeiting his safety for reasons that went deeper than council duty or treaty obligations, as Caroline watched his companions ride away in the strengthening light. She saw something shift in his expression, a settling of resolve that spoke of bridges burned and consequences accepted. "They think you're a fool," she said, standing beside him as the dust clouds marking the delegation's departure faded into the prairie haze. Maybe they're right. Toddy shouldered his pack, redistributing the weight to favor his old bullet wound. But some choices you make with your head, and some you make with your heart. This one's with my heart. The medicine from Quincy's well had helped stabilize Quentin's condition, but the baby still burned with fever and needed constant care. Dr. Monroe's clinic became their headquarters, with Liesel bringing school funds to buy ice from Spanish wells and Foxy Kate trading whiskey for medicinal tinctures from traveling drummers who passed through on the stage line. The town's few decent souls rallied around them with the kind of quiet courage that frontier life bred in people who'd learned to help each other or perish alone. But it was clear that Sheriff Hawkins was struggling with his conscience in ways that made him unpredictable. Caroline had seen him staring at Pike's money when he thought no one was looking, counting bills with the expression of a man weighing the price of his soul against the cost of doing what was right. One evening, as thunderclouds built over the western mountains and the air grew thick with the promise of rain, Hawkins appeared at the clinic's back door. His face was haggard, his usually neat uniform rumpled, and his hands shook slightly as he removed his hat. "I've been thinking," he said without preamble, his voice hoarse with exhaustion or whiskey or both, "about right and wrong, about what a man owes to his community versus what he owes to his own survival." Dr. Monroe looked up from his medical supplies, sensing the weight of whatever confession was coming. "Thinking's dangerous in a town like this, Bill, especially for a man in your position." "That's just it." Hawkins continued, his eyes fixed on the floor. "I've been in this position too long. Taking Pike's money, looking the other way when his men get rough, telling myself it's just the way things work in a place like Bear Creek." He raised his eyes to meet Caroline's gaze. "But there's some things that shouldn't be for sale, and a baby's life is one of them." The chemistry between Caroline and Toddy deepened through the practical intimacy of shared danger and mutual dependence. When he returned from hauling blocks of ice from the Spanish Wells depot, sweat darkening his shirt and his shoulder visibly straining against the old wound, she dabbed the perspiration from his brow with a cloth that came away gritty with salt and determination. Their eyes met in that moment, holding longer than necessity required. And Caroline felt something warm unfurl in her chest that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with recognition of a deeper kind. Later, when Toddy showed her how to secure Quentin's swaddling with a prairie nut that wouldn't slip even if the baby thrashed with fever, their fingers brushed repeatedly as he guided her hands through the complex weaving pattern. The touch was electric in its ordinariness, calloused skin against calloused skin, the simple human contact of two people learning to trust each other in small, essential ways. Like this. He said, his voice low and patient as he positioned her fingers on the fabric. The knot holds because each part supports the others. No single strand bears all the weight. Caroline understood he was talking about more than swaddling techniques. And when she looked up to find his dark eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken, she realized they'd crossed some invisible line between alliance and something deeper. The town's undercurrents grew more turbulent as Pike's grip tightened like a vice slowly crushing everything in its grasp. Baptiste and Roman, two immigrant miners paid in company scrip that was worth less than the paper it was printed on, began whispering of a strike among their fellow workers. Rumors circulated that the mill dumped waste directly into the creek during night shifts, poisoning the water with carbolic acid and metallic tailings that made it unsuitable for anything except industrial use. Foxy Kate, whose saloon served as the unofficial information exchange for Bear Creek's residents, maintained a careful ledger of Pike's various business dealings. The book, bound in cracked leather and written in Kate's precise hand, documented bribes paid to Sheriff Hawkins, kickbacks to county officials, and payments to Thomas Pike, Montgomery's cousin, and the local federal representative who rubber-stamped the mine's environmental permits. One evening, as storm clouds continued to build and the air grew electric with approaching weather, Kate showed Toddy a single page from her ledger. Her finger trembled as she pointed to a series of entries detailing payments made to suppress federal investigations into water contamination. "You didn't see this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But you'll need it before this is over. Pike's got more enemies than he knows, and not all of them wear badges or carry guns. Some of us just keep books and remember what decent people forget." The physical dangers escalated along with the political tensions like a fever that wouldn't break. A stamp mill accident sent a flywheel chain snapping like a whip, throwing iron teeth and sparks across the mill floor, where a teenage worker had been trapped beneath a fallen beam. Toddy dragged the boy clear his shoulder, screaming in protest as the old bullet wound pulled tight, but he got the kid to safety before the whole mechanism could collapse into twisted metal and shattered dreams. Caroline bandaged Toddy's strained shoulder with boiled linen in the clinic afterward, her hands steady despite the tremor of exhaustion that ran through her frame. As she wound the cloth around his chest, breathing close enough to his ear that he could feel the warmth of her exhalations. Something passed between them that transcended the purely practical. Her touch lingered at the knot fingers tracing the edge of the bandage with unconscious tenderness, and Toddy found himself memorizing the feel of her hands against his skin. "You could have been killed," she said, her voice tight with emotions she didn't name but couldn't hide. "Someone had to get him out. It didn't have to be you." Her eyes met his, and in them, he saw something that made his chest tighten in ways that had nothing to do with his injury. Toddy turned to face her, fully close enough now that he could see flecks of amber in her green eyes and count the freckles that prairie grit had failed to hide. "Yes, it did. When you see someone in danger and you have the power to help, choice is an illusion. You act or you live with the consequences forever." The words hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross, but Caroline understood their deeper meaning. He wasn't just talking about the injured boy. A prairie grass fire sparked by lightning from the approaching storm system crept toward Quincy's farmstead, like a living thing with malicious intent, consuming everything in its path with mindless hunger. Toddy and Carolyn joined the bucket brigade that formed spontaneously from townsfolk who understood that fire made no distinction between friend and enemy when it came to destruction. They beat back the flames with wet burlap, their movements synchronized by necessity and desperation, working in perfect harmony, as if they'd been fighting fires together for years instead of days. Embers fell like deadly snow, blistering exposed skin and singing holes in their clothes. When a particularly aggressive tongue of flame broke through the firebreak they'd established, Toddy shoved Caroline aside and took the full brunt of superheated air across his knuckles and forearms. Caroline pressed his burned hands to her cheek afterward, her skin cool against the angry heat of his injuries. The gesture was instinctive, protective, born of the kind of connection that formed between people who'd faced death together and chosen to shield each other from its worst effects. "Blast that fire," she murmured, her lips moving against his palm in a way that sent electricity racing up his arm. "Blast everything that tries to hurt the people I—" She stopped herself before finishing the thought, but the implication hung in the air between them like smoke. Dr. Monroe worked by lamplight as the storm finally broke over Bear Creek with the fury of all the rain that had been building for weeks. Water drummed against the clinic's tin roof like bullets, and lightning illuminated the mountains in stark, brief silhouettes that revealed the true scope of the weather system bearing down on them. Quentin's fever had begun to break the crisis, passing as suddenly as it had arrived, leaving the baby weak but breathing easier than he had in days. "Me on swear, he'll live." Monroe announced the words, carrying the weight of professional certainty earned through years of fighting frontier medicine's uphill battles. "Keep him warm, keep him fed, and keep him away from Pike's water. That poison nearly killed him once. It won't get a second chance if we're smart about it." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Montgomery Pike himself appeared in the clinic doorway, flanked by Hatchet Harry and two other men whose faces bore the particular hardness of professional violence. Rain dripped from Pike's expensive hat and coat, but his eyes remained cold and calculating as they surveyed the scene like a general assessing a battlefield. "I heard you were running a charity hospital." Pike said, his voice carrying the smooth menace of a man accustomed to having his way. "Admirable work, Dr. Monroe. But I'm afraid it's time to discuss the outstanding debts that make such charity possible." The moment stretched like a held breath, pregnant with possibilities that ranged from accommodation to bloodshed. Thunder rolled across the mountains, and lightning painted the clinic's interior in harsh, momentary daylight that revealed the truth written in every face. The real battle for Bear Creek was about to begin. Pike's gaze settled on Caroline with the proprietorial interest of a man examining merchandise he intended to purchase. But there was something else in his expression now, a hunger that went beyond simple avarice, into territory that made Toddy's hand drift instinctively toward his weapon. "Mrs. Webb." Pike continued his voice, taking on a quality that reminded Caroline of a snake preparing to strike. "I trust you've reconsidered my generous offer regarding your financial obligations. Time has a way of clarifying one's priorities, doesn't it?" Caroline stepped closer to Toddy, not hiding behind him, but positioning herself as an equal partner in whatever confrontation was brewing. "I've reconsidered a lot of things, Mr. Pike. Most of all, I've reconsidered the kind of town I want my son to grow up in." "Your son?" Pike repeated his tone, suggesting that even that basic relationship was subject to negotiation. "Yes, about that. Children need stability, Mrs. Webb. Security. The kind of future that only comes from making practical arrangements with practical people who understand how the world really works. Thunder answered him from outside, as if the storm itself was taking sides in the gathering conflict. Rain continued to hammer the roof with increasing intensity, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled its loneliness to the lightning-split sky. The lines were drawn now clear as barbed wire in daylight. On one side stood Pike, with his money, his influence, and his willingness to use both to crush anyone who opposed him. On the other stood a handful of decent people who decided that some things were worth fighting for regardless of the odds stacked against them. The battle for Bear Creek's soul was about to begin in earnest, and everyone in that cramped clinic knew that not all of them would survive to see its conclusion. Dr. Monroe sorted through the donations that had arrived throughout the morning, clean bandages from Mary Hargrove medicinal herbs, from an old Mexican woman who lived on the town's outskirts, and a small sewing kit that Caroline had reluctantly offered from her few personal possessions. The clinic's supplies remained desperately low, and every contribution, no matter how small, might mean the difference between life and death for the next patient who stumbled through the door seeking help. The sewing kit, wrapped in a faded piece of calico that had once been part of a dress, Caroline treasured, contained the usual implements of frontier needlework scissors worn smooth by years of use, thread in various colors, needles of different sizes, and a small silver thimble that had probably been a wedding gift in happier times. But as Monroe lifted the fabric tray to check for additional supplies underneath, a folded paper crackled against his fingers with the sound of secrets being disturbed. "What's this?" he murmured, extracting the document with the careful touch of a man who'd learned that unexpected papers in frontier towns rarely contained good news. The letter bore an official company seal pressed into red wax, still intact, despite the passage of time, and the signature at the bottom belonged to Roman Pike Montgomery's son and heir, apparent to the Pike mining empire. The date placed it several months in the past, well before Caroline's husband had died in the wagon train accident that had stranded her in Bear Creek with nothing but the clothes on her back and a growing belly. Monroe's expression grew increasingly grave as he read the formal language that lawyers use to dress up ugly realities in respectable terms. The document was an acknowledgement of paternity, Roman Pike's signed admission that he had fathered a child with Carolyn Webb and would provide financial support for the infant's upbringing. The witness signature belonged to Hatchet Harry, scrawled in the crude letters of a man more comfortable with violence than paperwork, but no less legally binding for its lack of refinement. Caroline. Monroe called his voice carefully neutral despite the bombshell he held in his hands. "I need to speak with you privately." She approached with the wary caution of someone who'd learned that private conversations with men in positions of authority rarely ended well for women in her situation. Toddy remained by the door, alert to the doctor's tone and the sudden tension that filled the small room like smoke from a fire that hadn't yet shown flames. "Is this yours?" Monroe asked, holding up the document with hands that weren't quite steady. Caroline's face went white as she recognized the paper, her hand flying instinctively to cover her mouth, as if she could somehow keep the secret from escaping now that it had been discovered. "Where did you find that?" "In your sewing kit. Want to tell me what it means?" The story came out in halting sentences, punctuated by long silences and the distant rumble of thunder that continued to build over the mountains like the sound of approaching artillery. Roman Pike, young and arrogant and drunk on his father's power, had pursued Caroline during the weeks before her husband's death, with the persistent entitlement of a man who believed that money could purchase anything, including the affections of a married woman. Caroline had rebuffed his advances initially, but Roman's interest had intensified rather than diminished the way it often did with men who'd never been told no and didn't understand the concept of limits. When her husband died in the wagon accident, a tragedy that Roman saw as an opportunity rather than a catastrophe. He had appeared at her side with condolences that quickly transformed into something more predatory. Grief-stricken and alone in a hostile environment where widow women had few options and fewer protections, Caroline had succumbed to his false promises of protection and support. It hadn't been love on either side. She'd been too numb with loss to feel anything that deep, and he'd been too selfish to offer anything that genuine. It had been a transaction, though she hadn't understood the terms at the time. The affair lasted only a few weeks. Caroline said, her voice bitter with memory and self-recrimination. I discovered the pregnancy after Roman had grown bored with his conquest and moved on to easier prey. But I'd been practical enough to demand written acknowledgement of his responsibility, and Roman, supremely confident in his family's ability to suppress inconvenient scandals, signed the document with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never faced real consequences for his actions. Toddy stepped forward, his face dark with understanding, as the full implications of the revelation settled over him like storm clouds. Pike knows about this. Roman never told him. The boy was too ashamed of being caught and too frightened of his father's reaction to confess what he'd done. Caroline's hands shook as she took the document back from Monroe, her fingers tracing the ink as if she could somehow erase the words by touch. I kept it hidden, thinking it might protect Quentin someday. Insurance in case the Pike family tried to deny their responsibility when he was old enough to ask questions about his father. Monroe whistled low, the sound carrying all the implications that none of them wanted to voice, but everyone understood. This changes everything. Pike isn't just squeezing a debtor anymore. He's trying to eliminate evidence of his son's bastard child. If this becomes public knowledge, it could destroy Roman's marriage prospects with the banker's daughter and complicate the family's business relationships throughout the territory. The revelation reframed every interaction they'd had with Pike and his men in a new and sinister light. The debt notice, the threats, the pressure to force Caroline into prostitution, all of it, had been designed not just to collect money, but to humiliate and destroy the one person who possessed proof of Roman Pike's indiscretion. If Caroline could be reduced to working in Pike's brothel, her credibility as a witness would be destroyed, and any claims she might make about Quentin's parentage would be dismissed as the desperate lies of a fallen woman trying to escape her circumstances. He's been planning this from the beginning. Caroline realized, her voice hollow with the weight of betrayal and understanding. Every debt, every threat, every attempt to force me into his employment, it was all designed to silence me. To make sure that when Quentin grows up, there'll be no record of his true parentage, no claim on the Pike fortune, no embarrassment to the family name. Toddy's expression had shifted from concern to something harder and more dangerous, like metal being heated and shaped in a forge. The council mission that had brought him to Bear Creek suddenly seemed like ancient history, a distant concern compared to the immediate threat facing the woman and child he'd sworn to protect. This wasn't about water rights or treaty obligations anymore. This was about protecting a mother and child from a man who would commit any atrocity to preserve his family's reputation and fortune. If Pike learns we have this document, Monroe warned, his voice dropping to a whisper, as if the walls themselves might be listening. He'll do whatever it takes to destroy it and everyone who knows about it. The man's got too much to lose to let moral considerations stop him from doing what he thinks is necessary. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the rain-soaked streets with the ominous rhythm of doom approaching. Toddy moved to the window, peering through the grimy glass at the riders who'd appeared despite the worsening weather. Pike's men, heavily armed and organized for serious business, were taking positions around the clinic with the methodical precision of soldiers preparing for a siege. Al Cordor. They're not here for a social call, Toddy observed, checking his rifle and pistol with swift, practiced movements that spoke of long experience with violence and its necessities. Caroline clutched the document to her chest, her earlier despair transforming into something fiercer and more determined as the full scope of Pike's plan became clear. She'd spent months living in fear of his power, accepting his version of reality, because she'd believed she had no choice in the matter. But the paper in her hands proved that she'd been stronger than she'd known, smart enough to obtain insurance against a future she'd somehow sensed would arrive exactly as it had. "What do we do?" she asked, but her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "We fight," Toddy said simply. "But we fight smart. Pike's got money and men, but we've got something he doesn't." "What's that?" "The truth, and people who are willing to die for it." Monroe began gathering medical supplies with the efficiency of a man who'd practiced emergency evacuations before his movements, quick and sure, despite the tremor in his hands. "There's a back way out through the mercantile storage room. Leads to the alley behind the livery stable. From there you can—" But even as they prepared to flee, Caroline felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the fear that had controlled her decisions for so many months. She'd been running since her husband's death, accepting charity and scraping by on the margins of other people's lives, always looking over her shoulder for the next disaster to strike. The document in her hands represented more than just evidence of Roman Pike's indiscretion. It represented her refusal to be erased from the world, her insistence on existing in a place that would prefer to forget she'd ever lived. "No more running," she said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "Quentin deserves better than a mother who spends her life hiding from bullies and cowards." Toddy's eyes met hers across the clinic's cramped interior, and she saw approval there, along with something deeper that made her pulse quicken despite the danger pressing against them from all sides. They were partners now, bound together by shared knowledge and mutual determination to see justice done whatever the cost. The real war for Bear Creek was about to begin, and this time they held the weapons that mattered most. Pike's retaliation came swift and brutal, calculated to exploit the one weakness that neither Toddy nor Caroline could defend against their love for an innocent child who had no understanding of the forces arrayed against him. While Dr. Monroe rode hard toward Bluebird Crossing to fetch the quinine that might finally break Quentin's lingering fever, Hatchet Harry and two armed men forced their way into the clinic with the casual arrogance of people who'd never faced meaningful opposition. Liesel tried to block their path, her schoolteacher's authority proving worthless against men who'd learned their lessons in darker classrooms, where violence was the only curriculum that mattered. Harry shoved the barrel of his pistol against her temple, his voice carrying the particular cruelty of someone who enjoyed frightening people weaker than himself. "Step aside, schoolmarm, unless you want to learn what real education feels like." Caroline lunged forward, desperate to shield Quentin from the violence that filled the clinic like poison gas. But Quick Hand caught her wrist and twisted until she cried out in pain. The baby, weakened by days of fever, but finally beginning to recover, whimpered against her chest as strange hands reached for him with intentions that chilled her blood. "Please." Caroline begged, the word torn from her throat like a piece of her soul. "He's just a baby. He hasn't done anything wrong." "No," Harry agreed, lifting Quentin with the careful handling of someone transporting valuable but fragile merchandise. "But his mama has been keeping secrets that don't belong to her, and that makes him useful." They took the child to Pike's mine office, a fortress of iron and stone built into the mountainside, where the Silver Baron conducted his business away from prying eyes and inconvenient witnesses. The building's single door was reinforced with metal strips and guarded by two riflemen, whose loyalty had been purchased with wages that exceeded what most men earned in a year of honest labor. Montgomery Pike himself waited inside, seated behind a desk, that had been carved from a single piece of oak and imported at enormous expense from furniture makers back east. The office's walls displayed maps of his mining claims, framed photographs of politicians whose support he'd purchased, and a collection of firearms that spoke to both his wealth and his willingness to use violence as a business tool when other methods failed. But it was Pike's eyes that revealed the true danger of the situation. They held the cold calculation of a man who'd built an empire by crushing anyone who stood in his way, combined with the desperate fury of someone who saw that empire threatened by forces beyond his control. "I've built something here," Pike said to the baby in his arms, his voice carrying the weight of a man trying to justify the unjustifiable. "Something that will last long after the silver plays out and the miners move on to the next strike. The Pike name will mean something in this territory, boy. Your mother's little piece of paper threatens to drag that name through the mud, and I can't allow that to happen. Nothing personal, you understand. Just business." Quentin lay in a makeshift cradle fashioned from a packing crate, his tiny fists moving restlessly as the lingering effects of typhoid made him fretful and uncomfortable. Pike observed the infant with the detached interest of a businessman evaluating a troublesome asset that needed to be eliminated or transformed into something useful. When Sheriff Hawkins arrived to witness the proceedings summoned by Pike, but increasingly uncomfortable with his role in the unfolding drama, Pike's terms were laid out with the brutal simplicity of a man who'd reduced human relationships to transactions. "Debt paid in full when the papers returned," he announced, gesturing toward the baby with casual indifference. "Simple transaction, fair trade. The woman gets her bastard back and I get the document that belongs to my family." Hawkins shifted uncomfortably, his badge seeming to weigh more heavily on his chest with each passing moment. He'd overlooked many of Pike's questionable business practices over the years, accepting bribes and ignoring complaints in exchange for a quiet life and steady income. But using an infant as leverage crossed lines that even his compromised conscience couldn't ignore. "This ain't right, Pike," he said, his voice carrying less authority than he would have liked, but more conviction than he'd shown in years. "Whatever business you got with the woman, it don't involve threatening babies who can't defend themselves." Pike's response was to light a cigar with deliberate ceremony, blowing smoke in the direction of Quentin's improvised cradle. The gesture was calculated to demonstrate his complete control over the situation and his willingness to harm the innocent to achieve his goals. "Sheriff, you've been paid well to understand that my business involves whatever I decide it involves." Pike said, his voice carrying the smooth menace of a man who'd never doubted his own power. "If you're having second thoughts about our arrangement, I'm sure I can find someone more amenable to reasonable compensation. Perhaps someone younger with fewer scruples and more appreciation for the financial opportunities that come with wearing a badge in my town." The threat hung in the air like the acrid smoke from Pike's cigar, and Hawkins felt the familiar weight of moral compromise settling over his shoulders like a lead blanket. But something about the baby's helpless whimpering, combined with Pike's casual cruelty towards someone who couldn't fight back, finally pushed him past the point where money could purchase his complicity. "I said this ain't right." Hawkins repeated, his hand moving unconsciously toward his sidearm. "And I meant it. There's some things that shouldn't be for sale, and a baby's life is one of them." Meanwhile, back at the clinic, Caroline paced the small room like a caged animal, her maternal instincts warring with the practical knowledge that a direct assault on Pike's stronghold would accomplish nothing except getting more people killed. Toddy watched her with the patient attention of someone who understood that grief and rage needed time to transform into something more useful, something that could be shaped into a weapon against their enemies. "I'll walk through his door alone." Caroline said, her voice tight with desperation and barely controlled fury. "I'll give him the paper submit to whatever degradation he demands, if it means getting Quentin back safely." Toddy stopped her with a firm hand on her wrist, his calloused fingers warm against her skin, despite the cold rain that continued to pound the clinic's roof. We go together, smart or not at all. Their fingers laced for a heartbeat, not romance for show, but trust sealed in pressure. The kind of bond that formed between people who'd chosen to face impossible odds as partners rather than strangers. Caroline felt strength flow from his touch, the steady certainty of someone who'd made peace with whatever consequences lay ahead. "Why?" she asked, echoing the question she'd posed days earlier, but with deeper understanding of what the answer might cost both of them. "Why would you risk everything for us?" Toddy's response came without hesitation, though Caroline could see the deeper emotions he didn't name, flickering behind his dark eyes, like lightning in storm clouds. "Council duty is to protect the water. This water is the child's life. But it's more than duty now. It's about choosing what kind of man I want to be when this is over." But Caroline could read the truth in his expression, could see the way his gaze lingered on her face and the protective instinct that straightened his shoulders whenever danger threatened either her or Quentin. Duty might have brought him to Bear Creek, but something far more personal kept him there, something that made him willing to sacrifice his safe passage home for the sake of people who'd been strangers just days before. Foxy Kate's arrival with Baptiste and 3 other minors interrupted their planning session, and the saloon keeper's usually composed demeanor cracked by urgency and barely controlled anger. She carried her ledger book openly now, no longer bothering to hide the evidence of Pike's corruption from anyone willing to look at the truth written in her precise handwriting. "Thomas Pike intercepted my message to the federal marshal," she announced, setting the book on Monroe's examination table with a thud that made the medical instruments rattle. But not before Judge Morrison's clerk made copies of the relevant pages. "The wheels are turning, but they turn slow, and that baby doesn't have time for legal proceedings to run their course." Baptiste stepped forward, his immigrant's accent thick with emotion and determination. "The men are ready to strike. We shut down the mine, Pike loses money by the hour, until he returns the child and makes this right. He'll bring in strikebreakers." Toddy warned, his voice heavy with the certainty of someone who'd seen how these conflicts usually ended. "Armed men who won't hesitate to fire on workers trying to organize. You'll be giving him an excuse to use violence against your families." "Then what do you suggest?" Kate demanded, her patience worn thin by days of watching decent people suffer, while Pike tightened his grip on the town. "Wait for the law to sort itself out while he does whatever he pleases with an innocent baby." The answer came from an unexpected source. Dr. Monroe burst through the clinic door, his clothes travel-stained and his horse lathered from the hard ride to Bluebird Crossing and back. But instead of triumph at having secured the medicine, Quentin Needed his face bore the grim expression of someone carrying terrible news that would change everything. "Pike's men ambushed me at Arrowhead Pass," he announced, displaying a bullet hole through his medical bag and powder burns on his sleeve where a shot had come close enough to singe the fabric. "Took 3 shots at me before I got under cover. Would have killed me if I hadn't been riding low and fast when they opened fire." He pulled a small bottle from his bag, the precious quinine that represented Quentin's best hope for a complete recovery from the typhoid that had nearly claimed his young life. "Got the medicine?" But they made their point clear enough. "Pike's not just holding the boy hostage, he's declared war on anyone who tries to help him." Caroline stared at the bottle, understanding that Pike's desperation had reached levels that made rational negotiation impossible. The man had committed himself to a course of action that could only end in total victory or complete destruction. There would be no middle ground, no compromise that allowed both sides to claim partial satisfaction and walk away with their dignity intact. "Then we finish what he started," she said, her voice carrying a hardness that surprised even her with its intensity. but we finish it our way on our terms. Toddy nodded, recognizing the shift from victim to fighter that had transformed Carolyn's posture and expression like steel being forged in fire. "What do you need from us?" Caroline looked around the room at the faces of people who'd chosen to stand with her against impossible odds. A frontier doctor who'd risked his life for medicine, a saloon keeper who documented corruption at personal risk, a handful of immigrant miners willing to sacrifice their livelihoods for justice, and a Lakota warrior who'd given up his safe passage home to protect strangers who'd become something more than allies. They weren't an army, but they were something more powerful people who decided that some things were worth fighting for regardless of the cost in blood or treasure. "Everything," she said simply. "I need everything you've got." The thunderstorm that had been building over the mountains all day finally broke loose as evening settled over Bear Creek, like a shroud transforming the sky into a battlefield of lightning and thunder that seemed to echo the human conflict brewing in the streets below. Rain fell in sheets that turned the dusty thoroughfares into rivers of mud, and the wind howled through the gaps between buildings like the voices of all the ghosts that frontier violence had created. Caroline and Toddy approached Pike's mine office through the storm, and their movements synchronized by weeks of shared danger and the kind of trust that could only be forged in the crucible of life and death decisions. The rail trestle that spanned Coal Creek had become treacherous in the downpour, its wooden planks slick with rain, and the rushing water below swollen to dangerous levels by runoff from the mountains that carried more than just rainwater. It carried the accumulated poison of Pike's mining operation, turning the flood into a brown tide of destruction. "Stay close," Toddy warned, his voice barely audible above the storm's fury. "The wood's rotten in places, and a fall into that water would finish us both before we could even try to swim." They moved carefully across the narrow bridge, Caroline's hand gripping Toddy's belt for stability, as lightning illuminated the torrent beneath them in stark, terrifying detail. The creek had transformed from a muddy trickle into a raging flood that carried debris from the mountains, uprooted trees, boulders, and the accumulated detritus of human ambition, all rushing toward the prairie in a tide that would remake the landscape before morning came. Quick Hand appeared at the far end of the trestle with 2 gunmen, their weapons drawn, but accuracy compromised by the wind and rain that lashed their faces like nature's own punishment for their crimes. The storm turned the confrontation into something primal, stripping away the veneer of civilization to reveal the raw violence that lurked beneath Bear Creek's surface, like ore waiting to be mined. "Pike wants to see you both," Quick Hand shouted over the thunder water streaming from his hat brim. "But he didn't say nothing about you being alive when you got there." The first gunman fired wildly, his shot going wide as a gust of wind staggered him backward toward the abyss. But instead of waiting passively for the next shot, Toddy acted with the calculated precision of someone who'd learned that survival depended on making the first move count. He lunged forward, using the storm's chaos as cover, and tackled the gunman around the waist. The 2 men grappled on the rain-slick planks, their struggle made desperate by the knowledge that a single misstep meant death in the flood below. Caroline didn't hesitate. Seeing a loose section of railing that the storm had weakened, she grabbed it and swung it like a club, catching the second gunman across the shoulders just as he took aim at Toddy's exposed back. The blow sent him staggering sideways, and when his feet slipped on the wet wood, physics finished what courage had started. His scream was lost in the wind as the current claimed another victim. Toddy's opponent proved more resilient, managing to break free and draw a knife from his boot. But the warrior had fought in conditions far worse than a thunderstorm, and his experience showed as he used the man's desperation against him. A feint to the left, a pivot to the right, and suddenly the gunman was overextended and off balance. Toddy's elbow caught him in the temple, and the fight was over as quickly as it had begun. "Can you make it?" Caroline asked, her face close enough to his that he could see raindrops caught in her eyelashes, like tiny diamonds, each one reflecting the lightning that split the sky. "Together." He replied the word carrying all the weight of the promises they'd made and the future they might not live to see. Always together. Quick Hand, shaken by his companion's fate but too committed to retreat, fired again from the far end of the bridge. This time, his aim was better, the bullet grazing Toddy's flank and drawing blood that mixed with the rainwater streaming down his side. Caroline felt the warm wetness seeping through his shirt and pressed her palms against the wound, her touch fierce with determination, and something deeper that neither of them had time to acknowledge, but both understood completely. Instead of retreating or seeking cover, Toddy pressed forward with Caroline at his side. They moved like dancers who'd practiced the same routine for years, each anticipating the other's movements, with an intuition that transcended conscious thought. When Toddy feinted left, Caroline was already moving right. When she ducked low, he was already swinging high. Together, they became something more formidable than either could have been alone. Quick Hand's final shot went wild as Toddy closed the distance between them with the relentless advance of a man who'd made peace with death and found it wanting. The confrontation ended not with gunfire, but with the simple application of superior skill and desperate necessity. Quick Hand found himself disarmed, off balance, and facing an opponent who'd been forged by years of frontier violence into something harder than the iron rails beneath their feet. The mine owner's enforcer made one last desperate grab for his fallen weapon, but Caroline was already there, kicking the gun over the edge into the flood below. Quick Hand's eyes widened with the realization that his usefulness to Pike had come to an end along with his life. He made a final choice not to surrender, but to go down fighting. It was a choice that Toddy respected, even as he made sure it was Quick Hand's last. The mine office squatted against the mountainside like a cancerous growth, its iron-reinforced walls and narrow windows designed to withstand everything from Indian raids to labor disputes. But Pike's paranoia had also created a trap, and as Toddy and Caroline approached the building's single entrance, they could hear Quentin's weak crying echoing through the storm like the voice of innocence calling for rescue. Inside, Pike held the baby, while a lit dynamite fuse smoldered on his desk, its spark creeping slowly toward enough explosive to bring down half the mountain and erase all evidence of his crimes in one apocalyptic moment. The mine owner's face showed the strain of a man who'd committed himself to a course of action that could only end in destruction, his usual calculating composure replaced by the desperate fury of someone who'd run out of reasonable options and decided to embrace unreasonable ones. But Pike was too intelligent to rely solely on brute force. He understood that psychological warfare could be as effective as physical violence, and he intended to use every weapon at his disposal. "On a welcome to my office." Pike said, his voice carrying the false civility of a host welcoming guests to their own execution. "I trust you found the journey illuminating. My men have such creative ways of making their points, don't they?" Caroline stepped forward, pulling the folded document from her coat with movements made deliberately slow and visible. Roman's acknowledgement of paternity seemed pathetically small in her hands, just a piece of paper that had somehow become the fulcrum on which multiple lives balanced. "Here's your precious paper," she said, holding it up where Pike could see his son's signature and the company's seal that made it legally binding. "But before I hand it over, you're going to put my son down and step away from that fuse." Pike's laugh was ugly with triumph and madness, the sound of a man who discovered that absolute power corrupted absolutely, but found the corruption intoxicating rather than shameful. "You're in no position to make demands, Mrs. Webb. But I appreciate your spirit. Reminds me of your son's father, Roman. Always did have more courage than sense. The casual mention of Roman's name was calculated to wound, and Pike watched with satisfaction as Caroline's face flushed with anger and shame. But instead of breaking her resolve, the cruelty only strengthened it, transforming her pain into something harder and more dangerous. Roman was weak. Caroline replied, her voice steady despite the emotions churning beneath the surface. He signed that paper because he was too cowardly to take responsibility for his actions. But I'm not weak, Mr. Pike, and I'm not going anywhere without my son. Pike studied her with the interest of a man examining a particularly intriguing specimen. Your son, you say? But genetics are a funny thing, Mrs. Webb. The boy carries Pike blood, which makes him family. And I protect my family even from their own mothers when necessary. He was playing with her now, using words as weapons to inflict maximum psychological damage before moving to the physical finale. But Pike had made a crucial error in his calculations. He'd underestimated the bond that had formed between Caroline and Toddy, and the lengths to which they'd go to protect each other and the child they'd both come to love. You want to know about family? Toddy said, speaking for the first time since entering the office. Let me tell you about family. Family doesn't use children as shields. Family doesn't poison the water that children drink. Family doesn't threaten innocence to protect guilty secrets. Pike's attention shifted to the warrior, and Caroline could see something dangerous kindle in the mine owner's eyes. The noble savage speaks. How refreshing. Tell me, Indian, what makes you think you have any say in how white folks handle their business? Because that child's life matters more than your family's reputation. Toddy replied, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. And because some things are worth dying for. The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. And Pike recognized the moment for what it was, the point at which negotiation ended and violence began. But he'd spent too many years building his empire to surrender it to a half-breed warrior and a widow with pretensions above her station. So be it. Pike said, his hand moving toward his weapon. But remember, both of you, I didn't choose this path. You forced me to it. The confrontation that followed was brief but brutal, compressed into moments that would replay in survivors' memories for the rest of their lives. Pike drew his pistol with the smooth motion of someone who'd always believed that violence was the ultimate argument. But he'd made the mistake of focusing his attention on Toddy while forgetting that Caroline had become something more dangerous than a desperate mother. She'd become a woman with nothing left to lose. As Pike fired at Toddy, Caroline threw herself between them, using her body as a shield, in a gesture that spoke to depths of feeling that went beyond rational thought. The bullet that had been meant for Toddy's heart caught her in the shoulder, instead spinning her around and sending her crashing into the wall with force that drove the breath from her lungs. But her sacrifice bought Toddy the moment he needed. Before Pike could fire again, the warrior was across the room, his hand closing around Pike's wrist with crushing force. The two men struggled for control of the weapon, their battle taking them closer to the desk, where the dynamite fuse continued its inexorable journey toward explosion and oblivion. You should have taken my offer. Pike snarled, his face inches from Toddy's as they grappled. You could have lived. The woman could have worked off her debt in comfort. The child could have grown up with advantages. Instead, you'll all burn together. Better to burn free than live as slaves, Toddy replied, using Pike's own momentum against him to drive him backward toward the fuse. Besides, you made one mistake. What's that? You assumed we came here to bargain. With a final surge of strength, Toddy broke Pike's grip on the pistol and turned it toward the man who'd terrorized Bear Creek for too long. But before he could fire, a new voice cut through the chaos of their struggle, Sheriff Hawkins standing in the doorway, with his own weapon drawn, and his face set in lines of grim determination. "That's enough." Hawkins said, his voice carrying an authority that had been absent for too many years. "Montgomery Pike, you're under arrest for kidnapping, extortion, and threatening the life of a child. And before you start talking about bribes and arrangements, know that I'm done being your bought man." "Yeah, Joe." Pike's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, anger, and finally a cold calculation that was more frightening than his earlier rage. "You can't arrest me, Bill. You work for me, remember? Have for years." "Not anymore." Hawkins replied, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was doing. "I found something tonight, found what it feels like to be a lawman instead of just another one of your hired guns. And you know what I like the feeling." But Pike was far from finished. With the desperate cunning of a cornered animal, he made one final play for victory. His free hand shot out toward the dynamite fuse, not to extinguish it, but to knock it closer to the explosive charges he'd placed around the office. "If I can't have my empire," he snarled, "then nobody gets anything." The explosion that followed was like the mountain's own thunder, a sound that seemed to come from the Earth's core and shake the foundations of the world. But it wasn't the controlled demolition Pike had planned. It was something far more chaotic and destructive, triggered by the intersection of human desperation with forces beyond anyone's ability to control. Hatchet Harry, who had been waiting in the office's back rooms with Quentin, heard the commotion and made a final desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of Pike's plans. He grabbed the baby from his makeshift cradle and bolted through a side door that led into the mine's tunnels, seeking the kind of darkness where screams couldn't be heard and evidence could disappear without inconvenient questions. Caroline and Toddy pursued them into the flooding drift, their feet splashing through water that rose from ankle-deep to knee-deep with each step, and they took deeper into the mine's bowels. The storm above had found its way into the tunnels through cracks and fissures, turning the underground passages into a subterranean river that carried the taste of metal and chemicals and human desperation. The chase through the flooded mine became a nightmare of navigation. Through passages that twisted and branched like the arteries of some vast, dying beast. Water roared through side channels with the force of rapids, while ceiling timbers groaned under the weight of accumulated moisture and unstable rock. The darkness was absolute, except for the feeble light of their torches, which created a bubble of visibility that only emphasized the vast unknowns lurking beyond its reach. Harry had the advantage of familiarity with the mine's layout, but he was hampered by the need to carry Quentin safely through the treacherous conditions. The baby's cries echoed off the stone walls, creating a chorus of sound that made it impossible to determine which direction led toward escape and which toward deeper entrapment. "Now this way." Toddy called, his voice barely audible above the sound of rushing water. "The main shaft is this way." But Harry had other plans. Instead of fleeing toward the surface, he was leading them deeper into the mine, toward chambers where the water would be deeper and the chances of rescue more remote. It was a desperate gambit, but desperation made people dangerous in ways that calculation could never match. Caroline stumbled on the uneven floor, her shoulders screaming in protest from Pike's bullet, but Toddy's hand was there to steady her before she could fall. Their eyes met in the torchlight, and she saw something in his expression that made her heart race with more than just fear. "I won't let anything happen to you," he said, his voice fierce with promise. "Either of you." "I know," she replied, her fingers tightening on his. "That's why I'm not afraid anymore." The pursuit continued through chambers that seemed to stretch on forever, each one presenting new hazards and challenges. Pools of standing water concealed holes that could break an ankle or worse. Loose rocks fell from the ceiling without warning, and the air itself grew thick with dust and the lingering smell of explosives. Finally, they cornered Harry in a dead-end chamber where the water had risen nearly to waist level, and continued climbing with each passing minute. The enforcer stood with his back to the wall, Quentin clutched against his chest. Like a human shield, his eyes wild with the desperation of a man who'd realized that all his choices had led to this moment of reckoning. "Stay back." Harry snarled, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "I'll drown him before I let you take him." Pike's orders were clear: no witnesses, no evidence, no problems. But Caroline had reached the end of her patience with men who used children as pawns in their games of power and greed. Without hesitation, she lunged forward through the rising water, her movements powered by a mother's fury and the kind of strength that came from having nothing left to lose. Harry tried to evade her, but the water slowed his movements, and Caroline's desperation gave her speed he couldn't match. She struck him with the force of months of suppressed rage, her fist connecting with his jaw in a blow that sent him staggering backward. Quentin slipped from his grasp, sliding toward the dark water that would claim him as surely as it had claimed Pike's other victims. Toddy dove forward, his injured shoulder, screaming in protest as he stretched his full length to catch the swaddled bundle before the current could take it. His fingers closed around wet cloth, just as the baby's head would have gone under, and he rolled backward to press Quentin against Caroline's chest with hands that shook from relief and exhaustion. "But hold him," Toddy gasped, water streaming from his hair and clothes. "Don't let go. No matter what happens, don't let go." Behind them, the sound of rushing water grew louder as the mine's pumping system failed, and the chambers began to flood in earnest. They had minutes, maybe less, before the entire section would be underwater, and their chance of escape would disappear forever. But Harry wasn't finished yet. With the last of his strength, he pulled a knife from his boot and made one final lunge at Caroline, determined to complete his mission, even if it meant his own death. The blade flashed in the torchlight, aimed at her heart with the precision of someone who'd killed before and felt no remorse for adding to his tally. Toddy intercepted the attack, his own knife appearing in his hand as if by magic. The two men struggled in the rising water, their battle made desperate by the knowledge that only one of them would leave the chamber alive. Steel rang against steel, and the sound of their combat echoed through the tunnels like the tolling of funeral bells. The fight was brief, but savage, settled not by superior skill, but by the simple fact that Toddy was fighting for love, while Harry was fighting for money. In the end, love proved the stronger motivation, and Harry's body joined the flood that was already claiming so much of Pike's empire. But their troubles were far from over. The water continued to rise. The route they'd taken into the mine was already impassable. They needed another way out, and they needed it fast. "The air shaft," Toddy said, studying the chamber's layout in the flickering torchlight. "There should be an air shaft somewhere in this section, if we can reach it." "If," Caroline repeated, but her voice carried determination rather than despair. "That's been the story of our lives lately, but we've beaten the odds before." They found the shaft exactly where Toddy had predicted, a narrow opening that led upward through the mountain toward blessed sunlight and clean air. But climbing it would require them to move carefully and quietly, with Quentin secured between them and no room for error. The ascent was a nightmare of physical endurance and mental fortitude. Caroline's wounded shoulder made every upward movement an agony, while Toddy's earlier injuries protested each shift of his weight on the rough stone handholds. Quentin mercifully slept through most of the ordeal, exhausted by his ordeal and lulled by the rhythm of their movement. They emerged from the mine just as dawn was breaking over Bear Creek, their bodies aching and their clothes torn, but alive and together. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape transformed by violence and water into something that looked more like a battlefield than a frontier town. Behind them, the mine continued to flood and collapse, taking with it the last physical remnants of Pike's empire. The man himself was buried somewhere beneath tons of rock and rushing water. His dreams of dynasty and legacy reduced to rubble and ruin. Dawn broke gray and smoky over Bear Creek, the air thick with dust from the collapsed mine and the acrid smell of wet ashes from fires that had burned themselves out during the night. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape transformed by violence and water into something that looked more like the aftermath of a war than a peaceful frontier settlement. Dr. Monroe worked by the light of oil lamps on his clinic porch, stitching Caroline's shoulder where Pike's bullet had torn through muscle and sinew, and cleaning the various cuts and bruises that marked both her and Toddy, like badges of survival. Liesel kept Quentin wrapped in heated bricks and clean blankets, the baby's fever finally broken, and his breathing steady for the first time in what felt like years. "You were lucky," Monroe muttered as he tied off the last suture in Caroline's shoulder, his hands steady despite the exhaustion that lined his face. Few inches to the right, and that bullet would have found something vital. Few inches to the left, and Toddy's injuries could have been fatal. Luck or providence, take your pick. But Caroline knew their survival had been about more than luck. It had been about choices, her choice to trust a stranger who'd knelt in the street to help her child, Toddy's choice to stay beyond the safety of diplomatic immunity, and the choices made by ordinary people who decided that some things were worth fighting for regardless of the personal cost. Sheriff Hawkins approached the clinic with his hat in his hands and an expression that mixed relief with something that might have been called rebirth. He no longer carried himself like a man weighed down by compromise and moral failure, but like someone who'd rediscovered what it meant to serve justice rather than power. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice hoarse from the night's events, but stronger than it had been in years. "About what it means to wear this badge. About what I owe to the people of this town versus what I owe to men like Pike who think they can buy anything, including a man's conscience." Dr. Monroe looked up from his work, recognizing the weight of whatever confession was coming. "Thinking's a dangerous habit in a town like this, Bill, especially for a man in your position." "That's just it." Hawkins continued, his eyes meeting Caroline's with something that looked like respect. "I don't want to be in that position anymore. I want to be the kind of lawman this town deserves, not the kind Pike could afford." He carried Kate's ledger book, its leather bindings scarred by rain and smoke, but its contents intact. The evidence of Pike's corruption, bribes, kickbacks, and illegal payments lay spread across pages that would reshape Bear Creek's future in ways that were only beginning to become apparent. "The federal investigators will be here within the week," Hawkins announced, settling his hat back on his head with something that looked like pride. "And when they arrive, they'll find a town ready to start fresh with leaders who can't be bought and citizens who won't be intimidated." Roman Pike appeared at the clinic just after sunrise, his hands shaking and his face pale with shock and fear that had aged him years in a single night. The explosion that had killed his father and destroyed the mine had stripped away the arrogance that had defined his young life, leaving behind something that might eventually grow into a decent human being given time and proper guidance. "I'll sign whatever you need," Roman told Caroline, his voice barely above a whisper. "Full acknowledgement, financial support, whatever's best for Quentin. I know I don't deserve forgiveness for what I did to you, but I want to do right by him, if you'll let me." Caroline studied the young man who'd fathered her son, seeing past his expensive clothes and privileged upbringing to the frightened boy beneath. Roman would inherit what remained of the Pike fortune, but he'd also inherit the responsibility of making amends for his family's crimes against Bear Creek and its people. "We'll see." Caroline said, her tone suggesting that forgiveness might be possible, but wouldn't come without a price paid in changed behavior and genuine repentance. Actions matter more than words, Roman. And you've got a lot of actions to make up for. The transformation of Bear Creek continued in ways both large and small as the weeks turned into months. Baptiste emerged from the ruins of the mine with a delegation of workers, their faces grim with the reality of unemployment, but determined to build something better from the ashes of Pike's operation. The miners had voted to form a cooperative, pooling their resources and expertise to reopen the most profitable shafts under new management that would prioritize workers' safety and environmental responsibility over maximum profit extraction. The silver's still there. Baptiste announced to anyone who would listen, his immigrant's accent thick with determination and hope for a better future. The mountain didn't disappear just because Pike did. We'll dig it out, honest, share the profits fair, and clean up the mess he left behind. The federal investigators, when they finally arrived, found a town that had already begun the process of healing itself. Wallace, the territorial representative who replaced the disgraced Thomas Pike, proved to be a man more interested in lasting solutions than temporary displays of authority. Under his guidance, new regulations were put in place that would prevent another Montgomery Pike from poisoning Bear Creek's water or exploiting its people. Sheriff Hawkins kept his badge, but returned Pike's bribes with a declaration that his conscience was no longer for sale at any price. The money, substantial enough to fund several worthwhile projects, went toward digging a proper well for the town and building a schoolhouse large enough to accommodate all of Bear Creek's children, regardless of their parents' ability to pay tuition or their standing in the community. Spring arrived early in Bear Creek that year, bringing with it the sound of clean water pushing through new community sluices that Quincy Hargrove had built with Tottie's guidance and the cooperative labor of men who'd learned the value of working together toward common goals. The creek ran clear for the first time in years, its water cold and sweet and safe enough for children to drink, without fear of the poison that had claimed too many young lives. Caroline chose not to marry, despite the social expectations that surrounded frontier widows with children to raise. Instead, she established something that suited both her temperament and her circumstances, a canvas-roofed laundry business beside the creek where she washed clothes with clean water, ran a small child care service with Dr. Monroe's medical guidance, and mended shirts for miners who now paid their wages in actual dollars rather than worthless company scrip. The work was honest, the income steady, and the independence it provided was worth more than any marriage certificate could have guaranteed. More importantly, it allowed her to maintain the partnership she'd formed with Toddy, not a traditional relationship by any measure, but something that served their needs and honored their mutual commitment to raising Quentin in an environment where he could grow strong and proud of his heritage. Toddy split his time between the reservation and Bear Creek hunting. When the seasons demanded it, training young men in the skills they'd need to navigate a rapidly changing world, and returning each evening he could to the small community that had become as much home as the place of his birth. Their arrangement defied easy categorization, but it worked for them in ways that conventional marriages often failed to work for other couples. The town's transformation continued in ways that would have seemed impossible during Pike's reign of greed and corruption. Liesel's new schoolhouse welcomed children from every family in Bear Creek, teaching them reading, writing, arithmetic, and the kind of critical thinking that would help them recognize and resist future tyrants who might try to exploit their community. Foxy Kate's Saloon became the unofficial town hall where decisions were made democratically, and problems were solved through discussion rather than violence. Dr. Monroe expanded his practice to include preventive care and public health education, teaching families how to recognize the early signs of typhoid and other waterborne diseases that had once claimed so many young lives. The chemistry between Caroline and Toddy continued to deepen through shared experiences and mutual respect, though it expressed itself in ways that would have puzzled observers accustomed to more conventional romantic relationships. They found intimacy in practical moments, the brush of fingers when passing tools, the way their breathing synchronized when they worked together on difficult tasks, the comfortable silence that settled between them during long evenings spent watching Quentin learn to walk and talk. One summer evening, as they sat watching the baby take his first tentative steps across the clean-swept floor of Caroline's laundry, Toddy reached out to steady Quentin when he wobbled. His hand covered Caroline's where she knelt ready to catch their son, and the contact sent electricity racing between them that had nothing to do with static and everything to do with the recognition of deep, abiding love. "He's going to be strong," Toddy observed, watching Quentin toddle between them with the fearless confidence of a child who'd never known anything but love and security. "Like his father," Caroline replied, and the look she gave Toddy made it clear she wasn't talking about Roman Pike. The final surprise came in the form of a letter that arrived on the afternoon stage, its official seals and legal terminology immediately recognizable as important news. Foxy Kate brought it to Caroline personally, her usually composed expression bright with something that looked like vindication. The letter outlined a civil judgment against Pike's estate based on evidence from Kate's ledger and the systematic documentation of environmental crimes that had poisoned Bear Creek's water supply for years. The damages awarded to the town were substantial enough to fund not just the well and schoolhouse they'd already built, but a host of improvements that would make Bear Creek a place where families could thrive rather than merely survive. Roman's acknowledgement of paternity helped. Kate explained, pointing to relevant passages in the legal document. Combined with the environmental damages and the documentation of Pike's criminal conspiracy, it makes a strong case for compensation, not charity justice, plain and simple. The money would pay for a proper hospital, better roads, and a telegraph line that would connect Bear Creek to the wider world without compromising its essential character as a place where people knew their neighbors and looked out for each other. But more importantly, it represented validation of their struggle proof that ordinary people could stand against corruption and win more than just moral victories. On the day the new schoolhouse officially opened with brass bells ringing and children flooding through doors that welcomed everyone, regardless of their family's social standing or financial circumstances, Sheriff Hawkins presented Caroline with a debt release that bore his own signature rather than Pike's company seal. "Should have done this months ago," he admitted, his weathered face showing the relief of a man who'd finally found the courage to do what was right. "Should have done a lot of things different. But maybe it's not too late to start." The ceremony that followed was simple and practical, befitting a community that had learned to value substance over style and genuine achievement over empty promises. Children sang songs they'd learned from Liesel, their voices carrying across the creek's clean water and into the mountains, where eagles soared on thermals that smelled of pine and possibility rather than sulfur and despair. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in colors that promised fair weather ahead, Caroline and Toddy sat on the porch of her laundry business and watched Quentin play with the wooden toys that various townspeople had carved for him. The baby had grown strong and healthy, his green eyes bright with intelligence and his determined jaw showing hints of the man he would become. What happens now?" Caroline asked, her voice soft with contentment and the kind of peace that came from knowing that the worst storms had passed. "Now we build," Toddy replied, his arm settling around her shoulders with the comfortable familiarity of someone who'd earned the right to such intimacy through shared trials and mutual trust. "We raise him right, we keep the water clean, and we make sure this place stays free for the people who call it home." In the distance, Bear Creek's new sign creaked gently in the evening breeze, its fresh paint bright against the weathered wood. Bear Creek water, honest and for all. The words represented more than a slogan. They were a promise, a commitment to the kind of community where children could grow up free from the fear that had once ruled their parents' lives. The final image mirrored the first, a figure kneeling in Bear Creek's main street. But everything had changed in ways both visible and profound. When Toddy knelt this time, it wasn't from danger or desperation, but from the simple joy of speaking to Quentin at the child's level, acknowledging him as a person worthy of respect and attention. Caroline joined them on the dusty street, and their hands met as they reached simultaneously to steady the toddling boy who'd become the center of their unconventional but deeply loving family. No grand declarations were needed. Their shared look said everything that mattered. We keep each other alive. We build something worth preserving. We face whatever comes next together. The sun disappeared behind the western peaks, and Bear Creek settled into the comfortable rhythm of a town that had found its soul and intended to keep it, no matter what challenges the future might bring.